Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Barclay Hagan, the Director of Client Care for OnPoint, and this morning we have Ganesh here to show us how to simplify job setups and start generating cash flow faster by using Spectrum workflow to route to the appropriate personnel. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please enter them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll have some time at the end of the presentation to address those. With that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Ganesh.
Thank you, Barclay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the session. So today we will be taking a look at the workflow module in Spectrum. And so there are different workflow types in Spectrum for different processes, job setup, new vendor, new customer, time card approval, etc. And today we are going to be looking at the job setup process. So the workflow module has got three main setup areas. The workflow definition, which allows us to configure the workflow with the different steps in it. It has got groups, which allow us to create resource groups with one or more contacts that will be assigned to complete steps in a workflow. And also workflow management, which allows us to see all the different workflows that are currently active and perform some administrative tasks on them as needed. So we can jump into the workflow definitions, and I just want to show you real quick some of the different workflow types that we've got in Spectrum. So obviously we are going to be focused on the new job workflow, but as I mentioned before, we can create workflows for vendors, for customers, for change requests, time card approval, and proposed purchase orders. So we are going to be focused on new job. So I've already gone ahead and created a workflow for a new job. So I'm going to jump into that. And once we create it, we will then create the steps for that workflow. So I've actually created just a very simple workflow with just 2 steps of approval. Now you may have a much more most likely will have a much more complicated job setup process with many different steps in between. But just to demonstrate how this can be used, I've created a very simple simple workflow process. So each step here can be a task or tasks that can be completed either in Spectrum or outside of Spectrum as your process setup process requires, and then the assigned resource approving that step, so then it can move on to the next step all the way till completion. By default, once the workflow has been activated or turned on, any job that is created will be set to inactive until all the different workflow steps have been completed. And once that has been done, then the workflow will automatically update the job status and switch it to active. Okay, so initially when you create a workflow, it will be inactive, and then you can create all your steps, make sure all that's functioning okay, and then turn it on to active. And then any new job thereafter that is created in Spectrum will be set as inactive. And we will go through that process here in just a second. Okay. So let's dive into this workflow. So as I mentioned, I've created just 2 steps very simply. The first one is for the project manager who's part of the construction group, and he will be verifying that the phases have been set up correctly. Once he approves it, then it will go on to the payroll department, and they will verify that all the job related payroll has been set up correctly. Okay. Okay, so let's jump into this first step and take a look at what that involves a little more in detail. Okay, so I'm going to double click on it. So I gave it a description. Okay, and a step can be set to always run, or it can be conditional, that is then dependent on certain criteria that we can specify from some data fields that are available to us in Spectrum. And we can say, oh, it must be only for cost center XYZ, or it should only be for this particular customer, or it should only be for a certain work state. So there are a number of different criteria that we can add to our workflow based on what we are trying to, what our job setup is going to be like. And we can add as many criteria and as many steps. And what Spectrum will do is it will start to go through these steps one by one in sequence. And if it doesn't find any criteria that is valid, it will just move on to the next step, and so on and so forth till it reaches the end. So that's kind of how the workflow step sequence works. It'll start at the top and just work its way down, and any criteria that is valid, it will execute that. Okay. So I have a simple, I don't have any criteria in this example, so all my steps are always required. And so my first step was for the PM to check the phases. It always runs, and I've assigned it to a group, which is a construction group. And we saw that earlier in the menu where you can go and create the groups and assign the contacts to that group. You can also assign it to an individual contact or to a role, such as a PM role or an estimator role, or some other role that we have defined in Spectrum. And then if that person has got that role associated with it, then it will assign it to them. Okay. We can disallow the person who creates the job from performing a step. And if you have a lot of different people in your process, then you may want to use this. If not, you can uncheck it. Okay. Finally, we just have some labels where we can designate whether what the approval label is, the rejection label, when it's due, and the function will take us to that particular screen in Spectrum. So if this is to check the phases, I can say go to the phases screen so you can verify that. So I have a lot of different screens that I can set up here based on the workflow step to take the user to that screen so they can then do what they need to do before approving that step. Okay. Oops, I'm going to cancel out of that. And you can also include some instructional text just to explain what the step is and what they need to do, so that it helps them as they're for the person who's executing it. Okay, so that was step one, just to verify the phases for the PM. And very similar to that, I created a step for the payroll department to verify all the payroll setup for this particular job. And I've assigned it to the payroll group, and I have made sure that when they click on it, they will go to the job payroll setup screen in Spectrum. Okay. And then the final step is to update the job, which will then mark it as inactive. Okay. So this is the sequence of setting up a workflow, and it applies to all the different workflow types. The process is to come in and set up the different steps, as many as your process requires, and put in any criteria that is required for that step to be valid. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a job and watch how this particular workflow works in Spectrum. So I'm just going to hit OK here, and I'm going to close out of the screen, and I'm going to go into job cost and jobs, and I will go and create a new job, and I'm going to click on new, and let's just call this workflow demo, something like that. And this is a workflow demo. And let's just put in a customer here, and I'm going to add a PM here. And my PM is going to be John Marsh. Okay here. And I'm just going to fill out some of these options here real quick. It's a fixed price, and I'm going to hit OK. Okay. So if I look at my list of active jobs now, I should not see my workflow demo. I'm going to sort by name here so I can see. So I don't have a workflow demo on my list of jobs, okay, because it is set to inactive. So let's go and see who the first person on my workflow definition that I had, and that was for construction, and the PM on that job, which was John Marsh, for him to check the phases for that job. So I've actually logged in as John. So I'm going to bring up John's Spectrum instance here. And if you look at his dashboard with the current workflow assignments, he has an action item or a step that he has to complete, which was assigned to him. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click on this. What this will do is it's going to open up that job, and it's going to open it up in the phases screen. And this was what we had specified as the function on that workflow step, to open it up in the phases and verify that all the phases are correct. And for this demo, I'm not going to actually fill out the phases, but John would come in here and fill out the phases and put in all his estimates and make sure everything is good. And then once he's done with that, notice on the left-hand menu, there's a workflow section here, and then he can come in here and click on approve once he has all the phases entered. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click on approve. And if I go back to his dashboard and refresh this, notice now that his assignment has gone. He has done what he's supposed to do, and it's gone on to the next person. And let's take a look at what that looks like. Okay, so I'm going to minimize John. I'm going to go back to my workflow definition, and I know that once the PM's done, then it goes to payroll. So let's go, and I've logged in as the payroll person, who is Gary. So I've logged in as Gary as well. So I'm going to minimize mine, and let's take a look at Gary's um, um, spectrum. And so on his, when he logs in on his workflow assignments, he's got a step now to complete. So if we click on it, and I had asked for him to be taken to the job payroll setup screen, and that's where we are now. So for that job, workflow demo, under properties, under payroll setup is where he would come in and fill out the work state, make sure the burden is good, any overhead, and if it's a certified job, any prevailing wage, union, make sure that all those conditions are configured. And once he's done with it, then he can go and approve this step as well. Okay, and that will then take it out of, if I refresh his screen, it takes it out of his workflow assignment. And let's go back to our original workflow definition, and the two steps have been approved. So the third step is to update, which would be an automatic step. And so if we now go back to our jobs and take a look at it, we should see our workflow demo job is now in our active list. If I hit go, search by name, and there is my workflow demo with John Marsh as the PM. Okay, so this job is now active and available for everybody to work on. So those are that's just a quick overview of the um, workflow for job setup process. So as I mentioned before, your process may be a lot more involved with different steps that need to be completed by different people. So we can create as many steps as we need and put in the criteria so that it meets um, every job requirement that you currently have. So it's a pretty straightforward and simple process, not too complicated. So if anybody has any questions, please do comment in the chat box, and Barkley will be happy to relay them to me.
Thanks, Ganesh. I don't see any questions at this time. So just wanted to say thank you everyone for attending. If you come up with some questions or if you'd like additional information or have ideas for other topics you'd like to see covered, we're here to help. Please contact us at 877-213-3860 or clientcare@onpoint-software.com. Also, to keep up to date on new resources and upcoming events, follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We look forward to working with you, and everybody have a good day. Thank you.